Crazy day yesterday, huh?
Yeah, it was. I cover national security for the New York Times and still working from my home in Northern Virginia. So was monitoring things closely, both on television, but also in close contact with sources via phone, including members of Congress who were locked down with some of my congressional colleagues covering the proceedings yesterday. By all accounts, a very scary day. Those 4 hours or so when the mob took over the Capitol, including the two chambers in the House and the Senate, before being cleared out by authorities.
Yeah, I mean, what was it? What was it like, really, just covering something of this magnitude, and what it was like hearing those kinds of reactions from your sources?
Well, we've obviously been covering protests here in Washington for a while, and particularly involving most recently the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington in June that drew, large crowds, and of course the police presence was much greater in those events. Some 5,000 National Guard, in addition to the police that were on the ground, fencing around the White House. What was striking was the preparation for that, for the Black Lives Matter protest, with authorities and officials in full riot gear, helicopters whizzing overhead. And yesterday, despite the warnings, obviously, that this event was going to happen yesterday, and knowing the president was going to go down there and speak to them and whip them up, the Capitol Police and the Metro Police here in Washington just did not seem to be prepared for this at all. A much smaller military presence, National Guard presence. I think they felt they'd kind of gotten burned during the June protests, and criticized for applying too much force, including military helicopters that buzzed some of the protesters. But I think just watching things unfold yesterday as the crowd actually marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, and then the images first seeing them kind of scaling the walls and then getting up into the building itself, and then the horrific reporting we saw once they're inside and just kind of rummaging around the offices and then getting onto the House and Senate floor, which are almost sacred places in our democracy, was really scary. And so I think obviously we were fortunate, even with this tragic loss of life. One person was shot and killed in the Capitol itself. I think three others had medical emergencies during the incident, outside the building during the protest yesterday. A very, very sobering day for our country. A day, obviously, that will really live in infamy, I'm afraid. And obviously, people are reflecting on it, Republicans and Democrats, as well as people from around the country, on how do we proceed from here, just 13 days from President-elect Biden's inauguration.
Yeah, it certainly is a very humbling and sad day. I think if I read your article correctly, I think only 15% of the National Guard, or so 340 troops or so, were brought in comparison to thousands that were technically available. And if my facts are correct, Eric, and you can obviously confirm this, did the Defense Department initially deny the DC's request to bring in the Guard?
Well, we got to remember what the role of the military is here in the United States. Certainly the very, very unusual for active duty military to be involved in any kind of domestic issue. And so they've been out of this, but the call has been for the National Guard, which are typically controlled by state governors. Here in the District of Columbia, it's a little bit different. Since there's no governor, it falls to the Secretary of the Army to kind of act as one. So when the mayor here in Washington requested some 340 National Guard, District of Columbia National Guard, to act basically in support of domestic law enforcement, that is the local police, doing things like handling traffic and crowd control, but from outer perimeters, that seemed to be okay. Where there's some controversy now is when things started heating up yesterday afternoon, right, roughly 1:30, 2 o'clock is when we first see the first indications that protesters are actually coming toward the Capitol and the House and Senate buildings on either side of it, there was a delay of it depends on who you talk to, whether it's 45 minutes or an hour before the Pentagon finally signed off on additional National Guard to be activated to support the police. Of course, by the time that happens, the crowd's already inside the Capitol. And the military, the Pentagon, that is, really does not want to be in the position of, and it's probably not even appropriate for National Guard to be the ones inside the building, clearing the building, unless it's absolutely necessary. That would fall more to, police and, of course, other federal agencies. Many Homeland Security, civilian law enforcement officers were on the ground, as we saw, going in, doing some of the clearing operations, and they were in full combat gear, riot gear, as they went and cleared the buildings and ultimately allowed the House and Senate to resume their proceedings about 8 o'clock last night.
Yeah. Absolutely crazy. I'm honestly still a little speechless by the whole thing. But I do want to talk about the journalistic side, because there are obviously there's opinions of people blaming this on the media and everything of that. And I kind of want to tie this into what really traditional journalism has kind of become. Obviously, you work for the New York Times, which is one of the more reputable and more honest, more middle of the road, if I could say so myself, middle of the road publications. But you see all these different headlines, and everyone's using certain headlines and all this different stuff, and there's a lot of inadvertent bias in those headlines. What would you take away in terms of the media and how they really reacted to this whole thing?
Well, I think, again, we've been on guard. Those of us here in Washington, having covered President Trump and his administration for the last 4 years, we've had to kind of grow into a new kind of coverage. He's a very different person to cover, and oftentimes it's amounted to somebody who is not as truthful as he could be. He outright lies sometimes, and we've caught him in that recently, especially since his election and his obsession, really, since Election Day, as the returns finally came in, pointing to President-elect Biden's victory, how the president just would not accept that. And I think it's been a challenge for all of us covering him to adequately reflect the avenues that were open to challenging the election results in individual states and at the federal level, and covering those fairly, whether they be lawsuits, whether they be any kind of reports of criminal acts, all the way up to the Supreme Court decisions. But in over 60 different cases, the courts ruled against the president. These are judges, many of whom were appointed by President Trump. So we get to this day, and he just continues to kind of stir the pot with baseless allegations of fraud, and baseless allegations of how hundreds of thousands or more votes have been dumped or trashed or whatever, or made up. Just no evidence for that. Or even some of his, as we saw on the floor of the House and Senate yesterday, even some of his biggest supporters up till now, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, the majority leader, took him to task, basically saying, if you ever had evidence of all this, show it to us. You haven't. And sure, there may be improprieties, and there are in every election, but nothing that's been presented that would be of the scale that would tip the election the other way. And so I think we were all kind of prepared for this day, but even then, it just kind of, it topped out, I think, even what our worst fears were, in that he would essentially incite this mob by urging them, after he had spoken to them down on the Mall, urging them to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and go to Congress, essentially inviting them to attack the halls of Congress at a time when they're carrying out these very important proceedings. And there's just no excuse for that. And I think it's hard to be objective when you look at that and you see people, his supporters, as misguided as they may be, I think, in terms of their information, having no excuse of breaching the Capitol and essentially, committing felonies as they enter it, going into the chamber. And so it's kind of hard to be objective when you're watching this kind of unfold, essentially a desecration of the key institutions of our democracy.
Absolutely, and very well said. So, certainly a sad day yesterday in American history and in America today. But I kind of want to switch gears on you here and talk about your own work, because you've been to the Middle East, you've been pretty much everywhere, covering a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of conflicts. Where does this sort of internal conflict, I guess I could call it, within the U.S. rate some of the other conflicts that you've covered?
Well, unfortunately, it is, and I think this has even been seized upon by some of our adversaries overnight in their media. It makes the United States look like a banana republic, or certainly some of the lawless states that I've covered as you point out, in the Middle East and Africa and other places, where autocrats rule, and if they don't like something, they incite a mob to go after their opponents in utterly lawless ways. And sadly, what we've seen today, coming out of dictatorships, places like Russia, they're laughing their heads off today, sadly, at the state of affairs in the United States. And what it does, of course, is it undermines the United States' ability to speak for democratic institutions and democratic governments around the world. When we see a spectacle like this, a mob basically taking over the Capitol, one of the main symbols of American democracy, how can any government, any American government, any administration go and lecture a dictatorship on some of the abuses that they are conducting against their own people? So unfortunately, President-elect Joe Biden has a big task. He already had a big task facing him coming into this office, with the country very much divided, obviously in the midst of a deadly pandemic, economic distress. And now for this to happen, I think it just underscores the challenges that he and his administration are going to have to face immediately. He's going to have to hit the ground running, do his best to kind of help bring the country together. Obviously, the runoff elections in Georgia on Tuesday have altered the dynamic here in Washington by creating a 50-50 Senate, which will be split by the vote of Kamala Harris, the vice president, basically allowing him much more leeway in his appointments and his policies. And so, but he'll still have, it's still very evenly divided, House and Senate, a bitterly divided country. And so it's going to be very challenging, even with these new benefits falling to him in the Senate, with the Senate tipping toward Democratic control.
Right, and we can only imagine and hope that his relationship with Biden's relationship with the media is a whole lot better than it was with Trump. So I bet you guys can only hope that he'd make your job at least a little easier.
Well, and I know President-elect Biden from his times as senator when I covered Congress, and he is quite a loquacious guy, very knowledgeable about many things, whether it's from his time as chairman of the Judiciary Committee to when I knew him best as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. But he's old school. I don't think we'll hear from him or see him as much as we did from President Trump. I mean, the one thing about President Trump you could say is he certainly was accessible. I mean, we heard from him multiple times every day on his Twitter account, which has now been shut down. But he also was very engaging in the media. And despite, his tendency, his proclivity really, to not telling the truth, he was engaging. You kind of always knew where he was thinking, because he never really could hold back. Now I think we're going to be going back toward a much more traditional president, with traditional communications. I can't see the president being as active on Twitter, certainly the kind of vitriol that he issued on Twitter that President Trump did. And, I think we'll see kind of a little bit more regular order here when it comes to things like regular press conferences and relationships, not only at the White House, but in the other federal agencies, State Department, Pentagon, where it will still be adversarial. It always is. But I think now I think everybody has just been so sobered by this last day of what's happened here. I think even I would at least hope some of these the raw partisan edge that's been exposed here in Washington for several years now may start healing just a little bit after kind of what we saw yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. And I do want to completely switch topics on you here, Eric, and talk about the state of the media today, especially, I mean, when you had closed, when thousands of like local newspapers have been closed, like I'm working now for a local newspaper, but working for a larger company. Um, how important is it to you that these big media conglomerates don't get their fair share and don't get their way in terms of what comes out in the news, and really have local journalists come at you with the facts?
Well, first, I commend you for your time in the local journalism there in Ohio. I got my start at a small newspaper in southeastern Washington State. Had a daily circulation of 29,000. It was small enough that they expected me to write articles every day and take my own photos. And I covered education, the local schools, in 3 different communities there. And it's essential to have strong local journalism, both to chronicle what's going on in the community, to be a check on elected officials there, whether it be the police, city hall, the school systems that I did, and just to be the fabric that kind of binds together a community. And sadly, as you pointed out, as we've seen, a lot of communities are losing their newspapers, or they're being bought up by large corporate interests that maybe are having to pare back on staffs. We're certainly seeing that as you move up the ranks in larger newspapers around the city. Many major metropolitan cities have lost their newspapers, or their staffs have shrunk greatly. And so I think I commend all of you who are working in local journalism today, because it's a very important place to be, to inform, the local citizenry. It's kind of where decisions are made that affect people the most, frankly. Their local taxes, their local schools, their local roads, these kind of things. Sure, you can come to Washington and hear, a lot of important policy debates, or, whether they're foreign issues and things like that. And we at the New York Times will continue to do our best to continue to push our coverage out on that. But it's important that we also give back, and the New York Times and other newspapers like us are trying to help and invest and support smaller local journalism, so that they can continue to thrive in this very difficult environment.
Yeah, and one more thing I really wanted to talk about is how hard the profession of journalism was hit by the pandemic and by the coronavirus. The loss of jobs in the journalism industry was tremendous. What was the sort of reaction on the Times end of the pandemic? And obviously you touched on it a little bit, and how they kind of reacted, and how they sort of got back to where they are now amidst the pandemic.
Well, obviously, we're all thrust into a situation, as most Americans, that we were having to work from home, and everybody had to kind of adjust to that. Whether it's as a reporter like I am, you normally deal face to face with sensitive sources, people who aren't very willing or comfortable speaking over the phone or other means. They want to meet face to face and size you up and talk to you, and so it's difficult on that level. But then, just from a production angle, having to figure out, when you're not all in the newsroom together, how do you actually put out a newspaper? And obviously, we're now very focused on our digital products, and we're very focused not on just the newspaper itself, but our audio programs, such as the Daily that airs every morning or afternoon in different communities, and are increasing, moving into video. So we've all had to kind of adjust as we are now, talking on a Zoom call. We've all had tons of Zoom meetings and figuring out how you work all that. But the journalism continues, and my colleagues who are based overseas, covering all sorts of things there, my colleagues who covered the campaign domestically, while we're not traveling nearly as much as we did a year ago, still getting out there, and obviously still being safe, taking the proper precautions when we do, to continue to put out a product that we found from listening to our readers and hearing from our readers is they want even more. They rely on even more. And not only are we bringing them, the news of the day, but we have whole sections now that are essentially devoted to how to deal with life in the pandemic. whether it's how to deal with your kids at home and what are the fun activities for them to do with a family, to dealing with the stress and anxiety that comes with being cooped up in your home, or dealing with the tragic loss of life that we have, and how you deal with elderly family members and not seeing them as often as you could. So we've taken on a role that we've always had, that is providing kind of a community service, even at the level that we are at the New York Times, and trying to almost promote it, certainly on a national, if not a global level.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't have said it better. Well, Eric Schmitt, I know it's been a very, very busy week, very busy couple of days for you. Keep doing what you're doing. We all really appreciate it. And thank you so much for taking this time to come on the KO Convo.
Absolutely. Thank you. And good luck out there. Peace.